Hello, readers in the Read universe. Welcome to the Read Podcast. The research, education, advocacy podcast connects you with leading researchers, educators, and thought leaders on topics in education and child development. Read is produced by the Windward Institute. I'm your host, Dr. Danielle Gomez, and today, my co-host, Jamie Williamson, Windward's head of school and the executive director of the Windward Institute, will be joining me for another special Lead on Read episode. We have learned so much from our leaders in the education space, talking about this central question: what does it mean to be a leader in education right now? And today we are joined by Dr. Amy Murdoch. Dr. Murdoch is an assistant dean of reading science in the School of Education at Mount St. Joseph's University. She actually did a lot of work with Cincinnati Public Schools as a school psychologist, and then later as a director for a number of different literacy grants aimed at bridging research-based practices into instruction, intervention, family education, assessment, really with this focus of equity and serving students from vulnerable populations. And with that, I am excited to introduce my co-host, Jamie Williamson, and our special guest for this Lead on Read episode, Dr. Amy Murdoch.
Welcome to our podcast. I'm very, very excited to have a little bit of time to spend with Dr. Amy Murdoch, who is we didn't have a chance to work closely together, but I knew of you when I was first starting my journey as a school psychologist in Cincinnati. And I still remember a PD that you helped put on with Dr. Roland Good, talking about dibbles at Cincinnati Public Schools. And I just remember his talk, and so much of bits of his talk have actually stayed with me for this entire time. And I remember, I think you did the intro for him that day. And so, I know you've been doing some really great work, and we're very, very excited to spend a little time with you today. And you've actually since I had known you a little bit in Cincinnati, you've actually been on quite a bit of a journey professionally, coming out of Cincinnati Public and doing some other things in that work. But I'd love if you could maybe just share a little about your overall professional journey as we get started, Dr. Murdoch. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I am thrilled to be here and appreciate your interest in my work. So let's see, I started my career in Head Start, working with preschool, as well as Cincinnati Public Schools, where I got to meet you. And as you mentioned, I am trained as a school psychologist, but I have actually never held a position where school psychology was in my title. So that's just an interesting thing. I worked on a variety of different research projects and grant projects, all around thinking about how do we support teachers helping their students, fully realize how to become strong readers. So I started in CPS, Cincinnati Public Schools, and Head Start. During my internship during graduate school, I did a project with a school which was kindergarten, and we used a direct instruction reading approach and looked at how to help children living in poverty really achieve strong reading skills at that kindergarten level. We had some really lovely outcomes, and so the district then hired me to kind of replicate that in 5 other schools. So from that work, I got to work with a number of other schools in Cincinnati Public, looking again at reading instruction and intervention. Yeah. And then from there, that kind of rolled into Reading First. So I was the director of Reading First in Cincinnati Public Schools, which focused on the 11 highest poverty, lowest performing schools. And it was a wonderful federal grant program that really helped us overhaul the way they were teaching reading in those schools. And we set it up within an MTSS framework so we could really look at intensification of support. So having good, strong tier 1, but then also intensifying supports for children who need it. And then as part of that work, I also got to work with a lot of people at Ohio Reading First. So at the state level, they were interested in some of the things we were doing in Cincinnati. So I had the privilege of being invited to be involved in thinking about things at the state level as well, which was a wonderful opportunity.
Yeah.
One of the moments, I've had like 2 moments in my career where I almost left education. Oh, wow. And one of them was when Reading First funding was removed. Because of lots of reasons, which we probably don't have time to go into. But it was really devastating because I saw some great progress being made and some great changes happening in schools with children, with families, really changes that were making things better for teachers as well, which I think is really important. But from there, I had a job with the Special Education Regional Resource Center in Southwest Ohio, which was a wonderful organization that served the Southwest Ohio region, helping them look at MTSS and again, intensification of supports around reading. Early childhood has always been kind of my main focus. And then the other point in my career where I almost left education is there's like a trend here. The CERCs were no longer funded by the state. They were a free service to school districts to help get professional development and coaching. And at that moment, I thought, gosh, this is just, it's just like you pour your heart into things and then funding goes away, which I think we're experiencing right now in our world. And I remember vividly, like looking online, trying to figure out, okay, I can't work here anymore. So they were kind of being taken over by another organization. And I thought, gosh, what am I going to do? So I looked at, universities. Oh, maybe I'll teach. I always thought I wanted to be in higher ed. And I came across the job description for Mount St. Joseph University to start a reading science program. And I thought, this can't be real. Like Ohio, you guys have a strong influence of balanced literacy. So do we with Ohio State University, Infantis and Pinnell. And so Ohio was very ruled by a more balanced literacy approach at that point. So I thought, gosh, nobody's going to hire me. And I read this job description and I was like, this is my dream job. I get to start a graduate program focused on the science of reading. This can't be real. So I applied and I luckily was hired, and it has truly been a dream job. Where I started first a graduate program that was focused on the science of reading for current educators. And then 4 years ago, we started a doctoral program with the same focus.
That's outstanding.
And then we also started a Center for Reading Science to serve our population as well. So
a couple of things that I just want to kind of lift out of that. One is I've always been as a school psychologist myself, like I believe that school psychologists are such an incredible utility player, right, in so many different settings. You were at University of Cincinnati. I was at Miami University, just a little bit up the road, kind of like, a little bit farther west and north from Cincinnati. But like both those programs, I think were really progressive programs for the time, right? The idea that, I came through Miami and my work was really about, I knew how to do assessment. But I was a scientist practitioner. So showing up and thinking about myself as more of an interventionist. How do I help teachers sort of think through intervention, monitor data, do all the fun stuff that I really think that like a lot of school psychologists miss out on, and when you're just testing in a room all day long, right? And so I think this idea of really the importance of having some good utility players, I think school psychologists are such a wonderful resource for schools. And I also love whenever I run into a school psychologist who's had a very non-linear and non-traditional sort of focus in their career. And I also want to take a moment to kind of lift up, I think so many schools and districts in Southwest Ohio were really ahead of the curve on a lot of this intervention-based work and tiered sort of service support, RTI, multiple, tiers of intervention, whatever you want to call it. But I think that idea of like using data to make decisions for kids and really focusing on the right work is just such a big important part of that. And when I was in Oak Hills, as a psychologist for a number of years, I remember folks coming from Mount St. Joe and just the really great reading program that they had there for teachers. That was, you're absolutely right, it was so different than a lot of folks were kind of coming, and even maybe in all the districts that many of us had worked in that were using, right? So I loved the program, and I remember meeting with their director early on. But I just want to take a moment to kind of lift up Southwest Ohio and some of the progressive work. Again, think about the utility that a really strong school psychologist can bring to a conversation. And have been really impressed by your journey since, many, many years ago, getting a chance to meet you at a PD in Cincinnati Public Schools. So when I was doing my practicum, I believe.
Oh, that's great.
So
that's great. Yeah, I love what you mentioned about school psychologists. I have the great fortune that I was trained in the science of reading in my graduate program and database assessment and decision making. And I never forget, like in my very first school psychology class, we had Dr. Dave Tilley as a guest in the class. And he used to talk about the role of the school psychologist going from gatekeeper. So kind of like what you talked about as like, the person in the room testing and that kind of thing, to life giver, which that has always stayed with me. Like frame. That's what we want. We want to be life givers, right? We want to help teachers figure out the best instruction that's going to help their students soar.
Yeah.
So that's always stayed with me. That made me think of
Yeah.
Dave Tilley's quote when you were
I love
speaking,
that.
Jamie.
And I think Alex Thomas up at Miami University, who I know passed away fairly recently, he the first article we got to read in Roll and Function was about the paradigm shift. And, from the volume, the 1 and 2 volumes of the best practices of school psychology, right, that he helped put together. And I just remember being so excited about that shift in the educational landscape, the idea, because, I was never really enthralled by the idea of being a gatekeeper of special education services. It just never sort of appealed to me. I wanted to be a change maker and impact, somebody who was having some impact, thinking about the systems that kids in schools kind of like were in and how do you impact bigger systems, which ultimately then for me pushed me into doing a little work over at Springer School and Center as a principal there for 7 years, and then continuing my journey in independent education, where I really got, based on my graduate experience about the science of reading and all the data work, to kind of live and sort of breathe that side on, and just in a little bit different space. But I still feel like I get to show up every day as a school psychologist, and it's like near and dear to my heart in terms of my overall kind of professional identity. So just really glad to spend some time with you today, like really thinking about that a little bit. So thank you.
Yeah, great.
I'm really excited about that too. And just hearing both of you speak, there's this, I sense this passion, this knowledge, this expertise, and there's a little bit of extra secret sauce there. And what it is, as a school psychologist, as someone going through a graduate program, you learn about the science of reading, you learn about data, you could potentially take that information and that knowledge and make change with the students that you're directly servicing, or maybe the teachers that you're directly collaborating. Maybe you're doing some work with principal or school leadership. But then there's that little extra piece, and I love how you said life giver. I kept thinking of change maker. And so, and I know through the through line of your career, Amy, and we do want to ask you the meaty question is, what does it mean to be a leader in education right now? But we're going to save that. I want to put a pin on that. And I want to return to this piece of change maker in your early career. And so when you were a school psychologist, what did you start to, what were some of those practices that you started to do or insights you started to gain about making change in the systems for ultimately improving literacy outcomes for the students?
Yeah, I think a couple key things. One is system. Rather than just looking at one child at a time, in many situations, and in the situations I was fortunate enough to work, we were serving a lot of children who were struggling with reading. So it wasn't just a couple kids who were a little tricky to figure out. It was, 90% of children not getting at benchmark. And so that's a systems problem. And so if I had approached that as, oh, this is a class in need of interventions, or let's focus on individual kids and figure out diagnostically what each individual kid needs, we're just not going to be effective at really moving the bar on, of those children's reading skills. And so I think that systems thinking was the main thing that has served me well in my career, is thinking about how do we change a system, and then really close in line to that is how do I collaborate with those most directly working in that system to work together, usually, not usually, always, to work together to solve this problem of 90% of our kids aren't at benchmark. That is not an intervention concern. That's not a child concern. That's something about our instructional system not meeting the needs of the children we have in front of us. And so how do we solve that problem? So how do we kind of think through as a collaborative group, what are our resources? What are our needs? How do we make sure that these kindergartners get to benchmark? Because if they don't, that is going to plague our school system for the next number of years, because now we have first graders who are even further behind and further behind. And so really trying to solve problems from that systems thinking, and getting the right stakeholders together at the table and collaboratively work together and say, it's not about us, it's about figuring out this problem for this group of children so that they can be successful. Because right now we're not meeting their needs. So I think that's kind of the number one piece, is looking at the problem solving the problems in front of you, and getting the right key stakeholders together and think differently and innovatively and say, okay, we can't keep doing this because it's not working. What can we do instead? And I can't figure that out. We all have to figure that out together.
Yeah. And I think that idea of showing up as a collaborative problem solver, because most school psychology roles or anything adjacent to that, the amount of power you have in a system is actually pretty low from an authoritative standpoint, right?
Right.
So you don't get to come in and kind of pound a fist and say, this has to change. Here's the data. We're going in this direction. You really have to do that through collaborative relationship building, data orientation, kind of bringing people along in a process. And I think that's one of the powers, I think, of when a really good school psychologist gets into a space and sees that systems level kind of challenge, and then does all that great relational work and collaborative work to bring folks along with them. That's where I think when you see systems that really kind of get overhauled and changed, I feel like there's a whole lot of that kind of like floats around that and helps kind of buoy that system through that difficulty and that change. But I remember, I think even I think you may have presented once at one of the Southwest Ohio School Psych Association like conferences on some of the work that was happening at Reading First and some of the overarching data, or maybe I saw that at Cincinnati Public. But I remember seeing some presentations about some of the outcomes, and you guys were getting really good outcomes from the data you were looking at. Again, that's my 20-plus-year-old memory of that moment. But like I do recall a lot of those really great outcomes, and I just remember feeling a lot of inspiration for the idea that like we can have a much, much bigger impact the higher up in the system and up the food chain we look at. How do we really monitor and measure and shift a practice internally? So thank you for that.
I love that. Oh, I'm going to keep saving my question. What does it mean to be a leader? I think we'll end to that because I like that conversation about the system piece. I keep wondering, actually, I love that collaborative work. I love the fact that you are targeting directly in the system and understanding that where the resources and needs are. You talked about earlier that one of the reasons why you left education, I might be opening up a can of worms, but is when the funding went away. And so how do you continue to work in a system when the biggest resource you have and need is funding? And how do you continue to try to maintain that continuity and consistency to ensure that all kids are getting that systematic instruction within the system itself?
Yeah. And just to step back a little bit. So to me, I didn't leave education, but I almost did.
Yeah, almost left. Yeah.
When I almost left it, I felt very confident that I could get another job. So it wasn't necessarily just about the funding. My heart was broken, to be honest.
Right.
Because I saw the changes that were happening and I saw like the lives that were being changed. And it wasn't just the children's lives, because the children's lives for sure were changed when we helped them become readers. But I'm also really worried about teachers. I think we make education really hard on teachers. And they come in, nobody goes into education because they're making millions of dollars, right? Yeah. They come in because they want to help children and they want to change lives. I mean, that's like the heart of a teacher. And so the other thing about Reading First that I saw was that when you gave teachers, and I've seen this throughout my career, especially teaching in the graduate program at Mount St. Joseph, when you give teachers the knowledge and skills to do their job well, they not only have great outcomes for kids, but they also enjoy their job more. Yeah. They feel connected to their schools more, and they want to continue in education. And I think that is huge too. And so I saw a huge transformation in the teachers that I had the honor to work with in Reading First, going from being very skeptical about explicit, direct, systematic, structured literacy to embracing it in a way that said, oh my gosh, you're never taking this away from me now, right? Because I've learned the secret sauce. I know now how to help my kids learn to read. And so that was just heartbreaking to me because I saw so many things that were really working well and supporting teachers and children begin to be stripped away. And so I think for me, I had a moment of great sadness, and it truly was. And then, I looked for an environment where I could keep doing that work. And then I found it at CERC. And same thing when CERC went away. So I think the message is education, unfortunately, that's the work we do. That's the business we're in. Things change, priorities change, politics change, funding changes, but somehow we have to find it in ourselves to still find that path to allow you to do your good work. And I definitely found that, when I worked at CERC, and then when CERC went away because of funding priorities, I got to find that at Mount St. Joseph. And so I do feel like I love Mount St. Joseph, but mainly I love it because it lets me do the work that
Yeah.
I want to do. I would be very sad if that job went away, but I also feel confident that there's other avenues to find your path to do that good work, because there's such a need for the work.
Yeah.
And it has good outcomes. And so it, it will succeed, I feel.
Yeah.
But it is a hard business to be in when things, when the ground moves beneath you so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I like what you talked about there. And I think I might have just been echoing a frustration and thinking about like how important continuity is in program and how outcomes can lead, you see these successful outcomes. And I'm so inspired by the work that you were doing. And so I'm grateful that you shared that piece in the way that you were pivoting, because in those pivots, you were then able to scale impact, right? Both
Right.
from the Special Education Regional Resource Center, and then let's go to a teacher preparation program, a teacher education program to continue to empower teachers.
Yeah.
So when in those types of pivots, really targeting the research-based practices and really teachers, what practices or tools and levers have you learned to push to impact this larger system?
The biggest lever is outcomes.
Mhm.
I think finding ways of collecting data, sharing that data, and it's the biggest lever to convince people, but it's also the lever we need to make sure we're doing the right things, of
Yeah.
course, for kids. But I think at all levels, data has been the piece that convinces people the strongest, right? So, at the child level, when I was working in Cincinnati Public, we would look at global outcome measures, things like DIPLs and Acadience.
Mhm.
And when you see that growth, you're on the right track. And I think the same thing, like in the area of higher ed, when I first started at Mount St. Joseph, there were there were two graduate students in our reading science program. So I was basically hired to revive that program and to change it into a reading science program. It was just a reading master's degree program. And then within like 3 or 4 years, we had full cohorts, and now we have a thriving graduate program where we have 6 cohorts a year of 20 students in each cohort. And that's data, right? So that's we were doing the things that the teachers needed, and so quickly word spread that this was a place where you can learn how to effectively impact reading instruction.
Yeah.
So I think data at all levels is what we should be looking to for our professional practice, and has always been the lever that has most strongly pushed change forward.
Yeah.
I love that.
And I think it's like having the right data is such an important piece of this. I want to come back to something you talked about the idea of empowering teachers and making sure because teachers' jobs are really, really hard. And I always come back to the frame of kids do well when they can, right? And I have to think about the same sort of framework from a teaching perspective. I think teachers will do well when they know and when they can, and when they've been given the opportunity to do well, and all the resources to kind of carry that load. And the school shall remain nameless, the teacher shall remain nameless, and the reading program shall remain nameless. But when I was doing my practicum work in Cincinnati Public, I remember popping into a kindergarten teacher's classroom, and she was really struggling. She'd been there for probably like a 20-year veteran teacher. So she knew her stuff. She loved kids. She wanted to do the right thing. And she was like, this reading program the district has me using is not working. So again, shall remain nameless. I think we probably could go back and do a little fill in the blank here pretty easily. And so I came in, I was like 26 years old. I'm like my graduate program, and I'm really excited to help this teacher. I run through some Ames Web Dibbles work. I can't remember which one it was, but normed the whole class, checked, and I gave her, and every child in the classroom was below benchmark. And this was in January, February of the school year. So not even remotely close. I gave her these 4 interventions. We set up these groups. I was coming in and help her, and she got really excited about this. So collecting data on a weekly basis, and she got so excited that she shared this with some district level curriculum folks who's like, my reading program's not working really well, but this graduate student's helping me out here, and this is working really well. Here's the data. I was kicked out of that kindergarten classroom. The principal set me down and said, you cannot go back into this classroom, because we've bought a reading program, and this is what she needs to be using. And I remember it was like one of the kind of like sunk cost moments, right? Like something, clearly you've got the old proverbial dead horse here. We're kicking it, and it's not, the data is showing that this is not doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And the course of action here is just to get the guy out of here who was telling them it's maybe not working as well.
Oh,
So we had a little bit of a, I don't want to get anybody in trouble 20 some years later, 22 years later, but like I would copy some intervention stuff and I would I would leave it in her mailbox so she could continue doing some work, a little bit of a rogue assault on that, if you will. But
yeah,
like like when she saw the data that kids weren't progressing, like her heart was in it. And
yeah,
when she saw the progress kids were making from her action and intervention work, her heart was also in it.
yeah.
And I do think that folks really want, I've not met a teacher who doesn't want to do the right thing for kids.
Same.
I really
Absolutely.
haven't.
Yeah.
And I think that we have done a massive disservice as a field sometimes. And sometimes that's been through like university training programs and also district level decision making, right?
Yeah.
I know Emily Hammer talks about this a lot, but there's moments where everybody assumes someone else has done something, meaning like a principal uses the reading program that the curriculum director recommended, and he assumes or she assumes that the curriculum director did the research on the science of reading and it has all the components. So there's like this kind of upriver trust that happens.
Yeah.
Actually probably doesn't need to be extended as often as it is. And then if we do buy the program, even the research-based program that we should be using, we forget to like think about, I don't know, fidelity of training amongst teachers and the support that it's going to take to be able to do that work. And that's where I just so appreciate your systems level focus, because doing work with an individual child always fed me. But like, I just remember thinking about like, well, then how do I've got 5 kids in this classroom who are experiencing something similar, which means I probably have another 6 kids who are on the bubble of experiencing something similar. So how do I start to think about the system of the classroom? Or really focusing on kind of a grade level or a building wide intervention. But so often in schools, the measurement for success becomes like, I remember the Ohio Achievement Test back in the day. I'm not sure what they're using now, but that was really like the motivator and the data that folks wanted to talk about. And I know many of our school psychologist colleagues were like, let's talk about what that is, and let's talk about how do we get some like more progress monitoring data to see how kids are going to do and progress over time on a skill-based kind of level. So sorry for that, but I just so appreciate that. I just had a few things I wanted to really make sure we touched on.
I love that. And I have to be honest with the both of you. I appreciate this conversation so much. And I also have to apologize because as the two of you are saying something, my mind is asking question after question after question. And then I find myself like, I'm like lost in the question. Then I'm coming back. I'm like, oh my gosh, he said something else. Dr. Murdoch, you said something else. What about this? And so I find myself, I think this is a good indicator maybe of a good podcast that like, maybe my curiosity is just overtaken my brain right now.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
That's great.
So I both apologize and I'm grateful for that.
We love good curiosity.
I
think you bring a lot of great curiosity.
Yeah, when your mind just decides to go somewhere else of like, where would we be in here? It's a lot of what ifs, actually. Okay, so we talked about data. I think that's such an important point. And for those leaders who are also readers, get it? Lead on read.
I like it.
We tried to make leaders on readers a thing, but we'll say leaders who are also readers. Listening to this, I think that's such an important point. We've talked about data a lot with other read guests. Dr. Devin Kearns was on a podcast back in January, and his message was clear, was follow the data. And if we had such stronger data systems, I think that would continue to, really start showing that where we could go and maybe illuminate some of those gaps. But let's talk about your work more about at Mount St. Joseph's University. So I would imagine being an assistant dean of a reading science program in a time where there's so much rapid change in the science of reading and both movement and challenges and barriers. I think this is where I'll put in the question. What does it mean to be a leader in education right now as an assistant dean of reading science at a school of education?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a lot of responsibility right now. In some ways it was easier when people didn't care about the science of reading and I did my thing and it was under the radar almost. Yeah. I know I have felt greater responsibility when I speak to be precise, not overstate things, not exaggerate, because I think that we don't want that, of course. And we want to stay true to what the science tells us and where there's gaps in the science and where we're still trying to figure things out. Yeah. because just like many things that kind of catch fire in education, there's a danger of extending our reach beyond what we do know. And I do see that a little bit in the science of reading right now in implementation, all for good reasons and all for good intentions, but states trying to put together like, oh, here's the list of the science of reading programs.
Yeah.
And that is problematic in many ways, even though I completely understand why they're doing that. They're trying to provide guidance and all of those things. It's that old adage is like, well, it's complicated, but yet people want the simple answer. And so I think there's a tendency to try to give that simple answer because people need answers and they need direction, but yet also honoring that complexity and honoring the places where we're still trying to figure things out. I think the other thing is to give space and grace to those who are learning. As I said at the beginning of this, I was so fortunate that I was trained this way from the beginning. So I wasn't trained in whole language or balanced literacy. In fact, there's some things in balanced literacy that people will bring up, and I don't know what they are. And I'll have to ask my colleague, like, oh, Beth, because she was trained that way and amazingly changed her perspective and her way of doing work. But I think that's important because our colleagues who do have different perspectives than us and different training, they still have a good heart and they still want to do what's right for kids, and allowing space to help hopefully have conversation around why we want to look to the science, what even science is. I mean, that's such a conversation that's happening or needs to happen in education. And so I think that's hard because we're all very passionate and we all have our minds of like, this is the path. And so I have to remind myself to take a step back sometimes and listen and make sure I'm hearing those who I'm maybe thinking are opposing me, but maybe we can, again, try to figure out where is our common ground, because we all have the same purpose of wanting to impact education and help education be the true, driver of equity and opportunity for children. So we have that same mission, and how do we find that common ground so that we can move forward? And it does start with listening and also not overreaching where the science isn't yet, where the things that we think we know but aren't completely solid are, and be open to that, because that's okay, because that's the way science evolves, right? That's how we get more science, by saying what are the questions that we still need answers to.
And I so appreciate that perspective. I'm thinking about a few of us were up at Yale Child Study Center last year, and Mark Seidenberg talking about a little bit of the balance and the big five, and how people come to the table often and think, oh, these are all equal sort of things. And you really you have to kind of think about that dosage. And in a lot of intervention, when you have some study that shows this thing that you're doing has some outcome, like where was it tested? How was it tested? And so we've been really thinking also about this idea of translational science and how do we help educators be better consumers of educational research and be thoughtful in the process. But I do think you're right. Right now, there is definitely the science of reading having a branding moment, right? And I think sometimes we don't unpack that beyond the brand of like, oh, well, you got to do SOR work. And it's like, well, what does that mean? What do you mean when you say that? And what do you look to help kind of provide that evidence and support? Because otherwise, I don't think we're having the same conversation at all points.
And I think what you just mentioned about, we know these kind of essential components of reading and how important they are. But I think the thing that we're still understanding, I mean, there's science behind it, but we're still understanding in terms of how we implement it in schools is the integration of those instructional components. So what does a strong reading day look like? A curriculum that includes, teaching spelling and phonics and phonological awareness and handwriting all together, because we know there's power when we can, in a smart way, integrate the components of reading and the components of language and linguistics to leverage, improving reading outcomes as a whole. And I think that's a great example of, we have great research around the components, but the implementation and the integration in a real school with a real school time constraints, it's like, it might be that kindergartners should work on handwriting, for example, for 20 minutes every day. How does that happen, right? With all the other things I have to teach that are also really important. And so I see that as a great need in our field, is taking this great research, but really thinking, okay, how do we do all of those things? Because a kindergarten teacher is not just responsible for handwriting. She has to teach, or he has to teach all of the pieces.
Yeah.
And so how do we really help teachers that research to practice piece and putting it into real classrooms and real curriculums and instructional programs?
And the question I've always had is, whose responsibility is that? I've had some great conversations with like Don Compton, who's down at the Florida Reading Research Center, about some of these things. And a lot of times, like when you're doing research and from the science side of things, like what is the metric of success from that? It's often how often you're cited in other research articles, right? Not about how well that thing that you kind of found or discovered made its way into the classroom. So where are those bridges and finding researchers who are willing to actually sort of take time? And the funding for this is not wildly available, right? People have a really hard time getting this side of the work funded. And we've had some great, like Emily Solari, I know she's talked about some of these challenges and some of the opportunities she's had been able to kind of work through and actually discover some of those moments of being able to do that. But it's really hard. And how do we shift a system around the funding? And because funding, if we don't have the funding, we can't do the work. And I know right now we're at a space where funding is like, we were on our call with our advisory board, and I'm not sure any of them were feeling really good about all the grant funding that's kind of drying up or put on hold right now, because it's stopping some of the base science, which is then stopping some of the translational stuff that we need to be doing, which I think ultimately will end up harming our system as a whole. But I do so appreciate when folks have that lens of, trying to carry a little bit of that water from the research side of things to the actual classroom and see themselves as like a vehicle for translational work.
Yep. Can I tell you that's exactly why we started our doctoral program?
Yeah.
So I don't know if this is okay time to pivot to that a little bit.
Please jump
I
right in.
have one other thought, but I want to get into, can I put a pin on the doctor? Because that's my next question is how then you create that system. But I love what you talked about with that integration piece.
Yeah.
And our team laughs because I think I use the word integration in like once an hour. But I want to highlight that because when we do work in professional development at the Institute, when we're directly translating that science, we talk about integration, but we really frame it within the sense of instructional practices and instructional language. And for that piece is how coherent is your program, right? You can be getting X, Y, and Z curriculum, right? It could say it's aligned with the science of reading. Maybe it is. And is it really coherent in the way that it's infusing those skills? And how consistent is it in the way of the patterns of your instructional pedagogy or your language? And I don't want to confuse consistency with rigidity or with just refusing to pivot or to maintain flexibility, but it really is that commitment to ensuring that these practices are being taught on a daily day with the time that they're allotted, and are they making those connections? Like reading and writing, for example, right? Writing about what you learn and what you read is a clear example of instructional integration and coherence. And then I do want to get to the MSJ, but I do have a funny story. When we were doing a professional development at a New York public school a couple weeks ago, and in prepping for this, they had adopted a program and really science of reading based. And our goal really was to, again, to provide that rationale, that language of validating the work they were doing and continue to provide that agency. And so at the beginning of the slide, our director of the Windward Institute, Alexis Pokna, was like, sometimes it just feels like a rock was turned and there was an avalanche. So I actually created a PowerPoint slide that was rock and then avalanche. And then my folks in the beginning were like in front of me, did like they went back like the avalanche was actually hitting them. But I do think sometimes that it is important from a translational piece to really communicate that, yes, this is a lot, but let's break this down in the way that's manageable for you, that's usable for you as well. And that coherence and that intentionality on language and practice that reinforce those skills are important. So I'm glad you brought that in, and I just wanted to mention that. So now let's talk about Mount St. Joseph. So what I loved, and I want to talk about the doctorate program as well, but you had an opportunity to build a program from the ground up. Okay, so let's walk us through that, soup to nuts. Like, how did you ensure the research practices were reaching every teacher? And then now on this doctorate program, what are you doing to ensure that you're building the skills in your doctoral students to be good translators or knowledge brokers in this sense?
Yeah, so the graduate program 18 years ago was when I started working at Mount St. Joe on the graduate program. And it was, as I said, it was like my dream job because they had a reading program that wasn't doing well, and they wanted to revive it and focus on the science of reading. And again, this is 18 years ago. So it was a very different educational landscape at that point. So I could not believe when I read the job description. I just was like, really? And I honestly hadn't even heard of Mount St. Joe because it's a small, it's a small school on the west side of Cincinnati. I mean, I'd heard of it, but I didn't really know anything about it. So the dean at the time was also a school psychologist, Dr. Myth Obach, and his wife, Beth, had done a lot of work with Dr. Marianne Wolf, and he was very interested in science of reading. They had a faculty member, Dr. Richard Sparks, there, who had always been science of reading. He taught their phonics class, but then everybody else on the education faculty was whole language, every single person. In fact, when I came to the interview, people would actually introduce themselves as constructivists to me, like, oh, hi, I'm so-and-so, I'm a constructivist. I was like,
a little badge on there.
Exactly. It was like, oh, gosh, So it was this teeny tiny little microcosm within this other bigger school of education. But the lovely thing is the master's degree program was relatively small because it was a master's in education. And so I think there were 12 classes. And Rick Sparks and I taught all the classes. And so we were able to make it a science of reading program. And I got to build the classes with Rick. And then we also had some other adjuncts we were able to hire. So it was like super controlled. So we were able to truly build a science of reading program. And it was right before the IDA knowledge and practice standards came out. We were actually we were in the first 7 schools, universities that were accredited by IDA, but it was before that. So we used Louisa Moat's Teaching Reading as Rocket Science, which was basically the, preface before the IDA knowledge and practice standards to guide the building of our program. So to your question, how did we figure out what teachers need? That we really leaned into that. And actually, Louisa was super generous when we were first starting the program. I was a letters trainer, so was Rick. And she was very kind to give us some feedback and support our initial development of the program. And then, as I said, it really gained momentum. We went through IDA accreditation when they started that. I think that was in 2009.
Yeah.
And that really helped kind of people see, like, oh, this is a science of reading program. We moved towards an online program soon after that, at the encouragement of IDA, because there were not very many programs in the science of reading. And so that really, propelled our work to a broader audience. So that kind of was the why around the graduate program. And I can't tell you how many teachers started, because this, again, was all for practicing teachers. And we would have special education teachers, general education teachers, reading specialists. We had school psychologists, speech language paths. So we had all sorts of, different related services who were interested in this program. With our IDA accreditation, we also started a dyslexia certificate, a reading science certificate, as well as our master's degree, which is what we have now. And I can't tell you how many teachers would come to kind of the first class. I always taught the first class, which was the psychology of reading, which is kind of like how the brain learns to read and just kind of welcome to reading science, really, and would tell me when we were face to face, like at the end of the first week of class, Amy, I can't tell you how many things in this first week I have been doing wrong, like, which broke your heart, right? And they would say, like, I've been teaching for 15, 20, 30, sometimes years. And you, like, in this first week of class, you've dispelled like many myths, I would call myths of education that I have like ascribed to. So I said, okay, we'll come back next week because we're going to tell you what to do instead. Don't despair. We don't stay there long. So it just really felt like a real need. And that's why I think it grew so quickly, is we did actually very little marketing of the graduate program. We didn't have a marketing budget, actually, but it just grew from word of mouth because it was unfortunately very unique in a graduate program.
Yeah.
And then about 7 years ago, when we first started thinking of the doctoral program, it was because so many of our amazing graduates and our people were amazing. I mean, they're teachers in the field doing amazing things. And then they come to get this advanced training, usually paying for it themselves because they want to know how to better support their students, right? I mean, that's their motivation. So many of them wanted to get their doctorate, and we didn't have a lot of places where we could point them to. And so the idea behind our doctoral program was really like, we know all of these amazing people in schools, either in leadership positions or in informal leadership positions. They might be a second grade teacher, but boy, they are really rocking the reading curriculum at their school.
Yeah.
And so we said, we want to create a doctoral program who take that amazing knowledge of practice. They know about implementation. They know about what is needed in schools. And we want to give them a doctoral degree, create a doctoral program where they then can get kind of the research background and the scientific thinking background, all the things that you do in a doctoral program. So that was really our motivation around creating the doctoral program. Was we wanted to take the current leaders in the field, because we see so much amazing background that they have, and then create a doctoral program that would build on what the knowledge they already have and help them work towards a doctoral degree. And gosh, we attracted the right people. In fact, they're very intimidating, our doctoral students. I remember when we got our first cohort, turning to a couple of my colleagues, Stephanie and Beth, and saying, I'm not sure if I'm smart enough to teach these people, because they already know so much about schools and implementation. And so what perfect people to be those bridges, to be those translators of research, and to be those scientist practitioners, and to really move their districts, their states in some situations to another level. So that was really our motivation. And so our doctoral program is set up for a full-time educator in terms of how we situate it. You don't have to relocate to Cincinnati. It's fully online during the school year. And then during the summer, we do have a summer institute where people come on campus and spend a week with us. But it was really with that in mind, that we want to create leaders who can bridge that science to practice. Another motivation is we really want to impact higher education.
Yeah.
We want our teachers to be trained in the science of reading from the beginning, so they don't have to come to my graduate program and tell me, everything you're telling me is things I've been doing and it's wrong.
Yeah.
Please tell me how to teach kids to read. You shouldn't go to teacher prep and not leave knowing how to teach kids to read.
Yeah. And I so appreciate that owning that responsibility. Do you know Katie Pace Miles at all?
Yes,
Okay.
I love Katie.
We love Katie. And now you were mentioning Marion Wolf. We also have big love for Marion Wolf.
Yeah.
But I really have been so impressed with what Katie's been doing in terms of her pre-service teacher work to make sure folks actually not only get the content, but also get a chance to actually work and practice on this. I really love that idea, because I just can't imagine, as a school psychologist, having maybe talked about giving IQ tests or giving some kind of assessment and then getting into practice and not having done it, right? Like I just don't know how that works. But so many programs really don't think about that end point. And they again, another assumption where the districts will teach them when they get there. And it's what happens is all that breaks down. And I so appreciate your sort of, as you're designing this, thinking about the really strong working educators in the field who need a little bit of that buoying and that kind of that sharpening of that and the deepening of that knowledge, but really starting with, let's find some really great people who are doing amazing work and help them build on this, and creating an actual path forward for that educator to continue in the classroom while also getting this really great advanced degree. So thank you.
Yeah. It's amazing. It's amazing to watch them as they're developing their we're doing dissertations right now, dissertation defenses. And so it's just amazing what they're able to accomplish, because they also know the things to study, right?
Yeah.
All of their dissertations are very focused on practical problems that they're trying to solve, which, gosh, just love that so much.
Yeah. Maybe that's the answer to this translational piece, is having all these an army of doctoral students across the country focused on translational sciences, so that, because they don't have to worry about funding in that space. It's for pure, the academic pursuit there.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe that's selfish of me.
Well, I like that actually.
I like it.
In my Hopkins program, I was a full-time doctoral student and working at Windward. And so I was able to identify a problem of practice that I saw happening in the broader education space.
Exactly.
And really try and solve that problem in context. And it's informed so much for me as a professional.
Yeah.
So maybe that's what we need. We need just all of these MSJs, like Mount St. Joe's doctoral students everywhere, just scaling that.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that.
We'll work on it.
We have 3 minutes. So any final questions that you have for Dr. Murdoch here?
No, I've just really appreciated the conversation today. in this work, you run into some people who have a lot of passion, a lot of energy, and I think are really trying to put some good in the world. And I think you fit that mold so incredibly well. So we're just so grateful to have the opportunity to kind of sit down and celebrate some of the great work you're doing, understand a little bit more about your journey, and gain a little bit more on your perspective on how you have really kind of helped shape that work. So I love to get a chance to kind of nerd out on some school psychology related things. So, forgive me on that, but it's just, and I really it's been fun to kind of pull up some of these thoughts from my journey in Cincinnati that has really quite honestly shaped, my work at Miami University, my work in Oak Hills, and both at Cincinnati Public and my practicum work, and then over in Milford after that, and the school psychologist and a lot of the educational leaders that I got to experience in that have just shaped who I am as a professional and continue to do so. So I really enjoyed it today.
That's wonderful. And Oak Hills is one of our partner school districts at our Center for Reading Science. So yes, good work still happening there. Sure.
Yeah.
I'll echo that. And I think the one thing I'll thank you for, first of all, both of you, again, is challenging my mindfulness, because in a good way, because I was learning all these lessons, thinking about this, asking questions. So I really appreciate that. And the other piece I want to just highlight, Amy, is when in the work that we've been doing at the Institute, and then also on this podcast and talking to leaders, the piece I keep coming up to is this theme of ambiguity. And I love the way that you've sort of just taken the ambiguity and been innovative and entrepreneurial, right? Having the opportunity to start a reading science program and a graduate program, having to navigate systems and data and all the transitions, I think is something that sticks with me. And then the other piece is managing the complexities and the paradoxes. There's a framework, a research framework that I have loved. I learned at Hopkins called paradoxical leadership. And I immediately gravitated to it. I'm not sure why. I think because paradox is something that's so fascinating to me, and polarity management is so fascinating. But I kept writing down all these examples of commitment to investment when you're navigating limited resources, navigating the complexities of research, but trying to communicate that way in a way that's not necessarily simple, but at least is tangible for folks, right? And then also pushing and advocating for this mission, but giving folks grace when they're not quite there yet. And so I really appreciate that about your work. And so I wanted to end with that. Is there anything in the last 30 seconds that you want to leave us with that we didn't ask, or that you just want to offer up to our Read listeners?
Well, I think just to remind us, I think we're all in this work together. And it is big work. The NAEP data that came out not too long ago reminds us of the huge disproportionality that we have in our nation. And if we truly believe that education, as I think we all do, is the way to, better our society and to create, happier, healthier, more productive citizens, I think, we have to kind of lean on each other and find that strength in each other and continue the really important work that we all get to do every day.
Yeah. Could not agree more. So thank you so much, Amy, for your time today.
Well, thank you for your interest.
It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
And maybe we'll run into you at IDA or at Plain Talk at some point. Yeah. Maybe let's maybe put a pin in that idea. So where is IDA this year?
Atlanta.
Atlanta.
So why don't we maybe try? Because I usually go down. I'm part of the Association of Learning Disability Schools. Their new National Association. I'm on their board, and so we always go down a little bit early. But I would love to get a chance when we're down there to actually connect and maybe grab a happy hour and continue the conversation. So
that would be great. I'd
catch
love
up on all things Cincinnati. Make me really happy. So
that would be wonderful. Well, thank you both so much. I appreciate your time.
Thanks. Have a great day.
And just finally closing off, Dr. Murdoch, will you please give us our final words until next time, readers?
Until next time, readers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.